Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Howdy, folks, and welcome to our little discussion here about wargaming, turn systems, activation systems, whatever you want to call them, the systems that determine when each player gets to go, how much they get to do on their turns, so on and so forth. So any wargame requires some method of determining when players get to go, and I would say the goal is to try and balance practicality, effectiveness, and fun. Now, if it were possible, I think the best way would be simultaneous, kind of like what you get in a real-time strategy game on a console or on a PC. To me, that seems closest to what a battle would actually be like. You start with an overall plan or a strategy, but as the game progresses, you have to start making snap decisions and changes in real time as you react to and anticipate your opponent's moves. But that can probably only really work in a digital world, not on a tabletop, at least not with any of the technology we have yet. So games have come up with all kinds of interesting systems to try and simulate the simultaneous nature of warfare, to keep the game running, to keep everyone engaged, but also at the same time make sure the game is relatively balanced. And also every once in a while throw in some elements of randomness or chaos to keep things interesting. Now at the same time, you want to avoid so much randomness or blue shell elements in a game that it completely loses any basis in tactics, list building, decision making, and essentially you and your opponent could just flip a coin and whoever wins that wins the whole thing. The question, of course, is how do we do that? So let's take a look at a few different gaming systems and talk about the positives and negative aspects of each of those systems. I honestly don't think there's a single best way that overall is better than everything else, but I do believe that some systems have more advantages and fewer disadvantages than others. So like a previous video that I did, this is not some kind of ranking system presenting them as S tier versus F tier. Instead, it's just food for thought. It's meant to get a discussion going, and as we go through them, feel free to put any comments or thoughts you have down below. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's start off with probably the most well-known, and that's You Go, I Go. This is the method employed by games like 40K, Kings of War, and I believe War Machine. One player takes their entire turn, activating every model, unit, ability, spell, everything they've got on their side, all in one go. Then the other player gets to do the same thing. And since 40K and the majority of Games Workshop's larger games function on this You Go, I Go system, I would imagine it's the system that most people would be familiar with, or it's probably the first system that they ever learned on. Now, despite its faults, it does have some advantages, one of which is the joy, shall we say, of being able to come up with grand tactics. Like on your turn, having your long-range artillery pulverize some specific unit, then having your other ranged units offer supporting fire and whittle it down further, and then finally sending in your melee Death Star to finish it off, and then, after consolidation, leaving that Death Star right in your opponent's face. There's something very satisfying about that. It's the tabletop gaming equivalent of watching the opening scene of Gladiator. That is, at least if you're the Romans in that particular clip rather than the Germans, because that same advantage is one of the big disadvantages. The You Go, I Go system is also the tabletop equivalent of a slap fight. I mean, essentially, that's what it is. You hit your opponent as hard as you possibly can, hoping to either score an immediate knockout or hurt them so badly that their response is going to be diminished, not going to do the same kind of damage to you, giving you the advantage when it's your turn to slap again the next time. I mean, think about it. Just by killing a single model, you have technically made your opponent's first turn less effective because now their first turn has to be done with fewer models and fewer points on the table than you. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that first turn always wins, but if I'm not mistaken, statistically, it usually has the advantage. So that's where Alpha Strike comes from. I mean, it doesn't just emerge out of nowhere. There was an advantage to being able to go first in a You Go, I Go system. Now, when Games Workshop released the new Apocalypse rules a few years ago, the ones that crashed and burned so hard it could actually be described as apocalyptic, that one, it had what I think was an interesting remedy to the You-Go-I-Go system to make it a little bit more balanced, fair, and overall, I thought, a lot more fun. The first player still benefited from the initiative because they got to go first, but casualties weren't removed until both players had their turns. So that way, there was still an advantage to going first. You could steer the course of the battle, the other player was more reacting based on the damage that you inflicted, but they still got to use every single model on the table. Even if they knew at the end of the round this particular model is dead, they at least get to do something with it. Anyone who's experienced new model syndrome knows how awful it is to put your beautifully new painted model and it gets shot off before it does anything. I thought that it was a valid way of simulating the simultaneity, is that really a word? Whatever it is, the sameness, of combat and preserving the You-Go-I-Go system at the same time, but it also kind of blunted the alpha strike, at least a little. When I was a relatively new 40k player, I once played a game against a guy who had built a very, very strong alpha strike list, and he almost tabled me at the top of turn 1. He was a highly competitive player and didn't bother to turn it off when he went to the local gaming store for casual games on open game night. Of the 2,000 points in my army, there were about 500 still standing when I got to do quote-unquote my turn at the bottom of turn 2. That wasn't fun at all. Now, if we were at a tournament, then I have absolutely no reason to complain. He was clearly the better player. But this was a local gaming store, this was casual gaming, and the You-Go-I-Go system really made that evening miserable. Now, another disadvantage of the You-Go-I-Go system is that one player has very little to do on their opponent's turn. Players can potentially spend very long periods of time sitting there, waiting for your opponent to finish, especially during movement phases. The only time when the waiting player gets to interact is to roll dice simply to see how bad the damage is going to be, and that's not always a pleasant experience. Players who know the rules and know their armies can certainly trim down the amount of time that this happens, but a friend who watched a recent 40k tournament was telling me at the local Richmond Open that happened just a few months ago, he said it was like watching 5 minutes of action and then 30 minutes waiting for a ref to come over and make a ruling. And that's on top of waiting for your opponent to take their turn, and these were tournament players, so they knew what they were doing. Now, there is also very little randomness in the You-Go-I-Go system. The only randomness that's in there is when you roll the dice to see who gets the first turn, which can be a bit of a problem because it offers a massive advantage to one player simply for rolling a better die at one point in the game. Okay, so that's the You-Go-I-Go system. The next system, and the one that I'm seeing used more and more in most games, is the alternating activation system, where one player activates one model or unit, then the other player activates one model or unit, and then play bounces back and forth like a good ping-pong rally. This is the system used in games like One Page Rules, Marvel Crisis Protocol, Halo Flashpoint, Space Weirdos, Kill Team, a lot in Skirmish. But One Page Rules uses it in larger scale battles as well. Now, personally, I think there are several benefits to this system. First, players are constantly engaged. You don't have to wait more than a few minutes before it's your turn again. It allows you to potentially see and react to your opponent's strategies very quickly. If You-Go-I-Go is like a slap fight, alternating activations looks more like a well-choreographed martial arts fight scene. Alternating activations also minimizes the potential of alpha striking because at worst, your opponent can only destroy or neutralize one unit before it's then your turn. Whereas You-Go-I-Go, you could potentially knock out half the army, as I experienced that one night. But despite this advantage, the alternating activation system isn't perfect. It can be, I don't want to say abused, but it can be gamed a little bit. Elite armies with very few models or units have a disadvantage against mass armies. Massive armies can use chaff as basically throwaway activations, leaving their better stuff until the opponent has activated all of their models, and then the game almost turns into a weird variation of You-Go-I-Go. Now, some games, like Kill Team or One Page Rules, have created game mechanics either hard-baked in or available as option rules to try and mitigate this. So for example, in Kill Team, a player with fewer models can activate a previously activated unit, but with more limited options. In this way, the other player doesn't get to have multiple consecutive activations. One-page rules also has a rule in the advanced rule set that you can include that allows the player with fewer units to roll a dice on their turn, and if successful, they can simply pass for that turn, and activation goes back to the person with more units. Other games, though specific examples escape me right now, though I know I've played at least one of them, but there are some games that give the player with fewer models a number of passes equal to the difference between the units, ensuring that each player has the exact same number of activations every single round. I don't think I like that system. While it does make things perfectly balanced, I think the problem is that sometimes a difference in the number of units is a part of the way that an army plays. The trouble here is when the more activations get a little bit too big. Like if you play an army that swarms, one of your advantages is having more units. And if there's a game mechanic that automatically gives your opponent an equal number of passes, then that negates the whole point. I mean, it's supposed to make sense that if you run a super elite army with, say, 5 or 6 units versus a horde army that has 12 or 15, that's how it feels like a horde army. They have more to do. Whereas if you give the elite army 10 free passes, that just kind of seems to neuter it a little bit. And like I said, my concern isn't necessarily that some armies are going to have a few more activations. That's part of the army playstyle. My concern is when they have so many additional activations that, as I mentioned before, the player has found a way to turn an alternating activation game into a you go, I go game. And I remember watching a video where Matt from Mini Wargaming talked about this, where he was playing a game of Warcry, and his opponent would purposefully bring like a half a dozen just throwaway units, whereas Matt brought a more elite force, and the opponent would just move the throwaway guys, forcing Matt to move all of his men out into the open, and then the other player could then activate his good stuff and pounce. And it felt a little bit gamey. Not quite cheating, but not exactly game ethical, if you know what I mean. And like with You Go, I Go, there is virtually little to no randomness in alternating activations, other than that first roll-off to see who gets the first one. Okay, so let's move on to a third system that's vastly different from either of those two, because it is almost entirely random, and it's familiar to anyone who has played Bolt Action. In Bolt Action, you put dice equal to the number of units that you have in a bag, and your opponent does the same. You shake up the bag, and then the turn is decided by randomly reaching in and drawing out a dice. If it's one of the armies or one of the dice for your army, you get to activate any unit in your army. That dice is then put on the table to mark that unit is activated, and you draw another dice. You just repeat the process until the bag is empty. Now, I think this is a very interesting system because it takes the idea of alternating activations and then throws in a hefty helping of randomness. In fact, it is entirely possible that if all your dice are pulled first, you actually get a round of You Go, I Go. It's also entirely possible there will be an equal 1-to-1 pulling of the dice, in which case it's absolutely alternating activations as well. So it's an intriguing way of simulating the fog of war and forcing players to develop multiple strategies and to change their strategies and tactics on the fly as each dice is pulled and they realize, okay, the probability of the next dice being one of mine is this, and so on and so forth. You just never know if the next turn's going to be yours, so it's difficult to plan too far ahead. Now, the downside of this system is, of course, that with so much randomness added in, players may not like how little control they have over what and when they can activate. There's also the potential problem from the fact that there's no distinction of which dice are attached to which units. It's just one dice per unit, and that's it. So an army could take a small core of really elite troops and then take lots and lots of chaff just to fill the bag, and then when their dice are pulled, use them on the elite units. Now, those familiar with Mini Wargaming's game Ravaged Star will know they have a similar kind of system where tokens are put in a bag and drawing the tokens determines who gets to go. But Ravage Star tries to address this problem of all dice being created equal. Instead, they have tokens that are for each, shall we say, type of troop. So there'll be one token for elite, one for heroes, one for core troops. And so if you pull out a token that's for your army, but it's a hero token, you can't use it on one of your elite or core units. So it takes the randomness and then it kind of regulates it or tones it down a little bit. Now they have added in the feature where you can draw one of their special boost tokens that can be used on any unit. So it's kind of like a wild card. Now the downside of mini wargaming system is while I think it adds randomness, but it structures it. The downside is that prepping the token bag each turn can get a bit cumbersome because you have to take into account which units have been destroyed. You have to adjust the number of tokens. Depending on how many units there are, determines how many boosts. And so there's a little bookkeeping. It's not a lot, but if you're used to playing You Go, I Go or alternating activations where the next turn is just instant, this little bit of bookkeeping can seem to slow things down a little bit. Now, if we switch gears here and look at an entirely different game with an entirely different system, let's take a look at Blood and Plunder, a tabletop game that's set in the golden age of piracy. Blood and Plunder uses a deck of playing cards. At a regular 52-card deck. At the start of each round, both players draw a number of cards equal to the number of units they have on the board. Okay, so not exactly random. You're drawing a random card, but the more units you have, the more cards you draw. But here's the interesting part. Each turn, players choose one of the cards from their hand as a bid of sorts. It's almost like you play a little teeny game of war. You and your opponent put down the card you've chosen. The suit determines the winner. So spades trump all other suits, followed by, I think it's diamonds, so on and so forth. If both players play the same suit, then it goes to the card value. A 5 beats a 4, a king beats a 10, basic cards. That's how they determine who goes first for that particular round. So in this way, players are effectively bidding for the chance to seize the initiative. If you really need to go first, you will play the highest value spade in your hand, while another player might wait and play off their weaker cards and save the stronger ones for later to deal with what might unexpectedly develop that round. But there's another catch. Each card has printed on it how many actions you can perform with the unit. So the cards are not all the same. The spades typically have fewer actions than, say, the hearts. And so by playing a spade, you might win the bid, but you can only do one thing with the unit that you win with. Whereas your opponent, who played a lower suited card, they lose the initiative, but the unit they get to activate gets to take 2 and maybe even 3 activations. So you have to decide whether you want fewer activations first or more actions coming in second. Now, the way I've explained it here might seem a little bit complicated and convoluted. If you go to their website and watch, or their YouTube page and watch a demo, it's very clear, and I imagine you pick it up very quickly. It's a cool way to try and balance randomness with player choice. And it also has, a head-to-head roll-off, so to speak. The player has no control over what cards they draw, but they can make decisions with the cards that they play, balancing letting a unit go first with letting it do more once it actually gets to go. And of course, in a worst-case scenario, you play your best card hoping to seize the initiative, and then your opponent trumps it. And you not only end up going second, but you've spent one of your best cards. So it's almost like a mini-game inside of the tabletop wargame. Carrying on with this same kind of idea, the same company that does Blood and Plunder, Firelock Games, also has a World War I skirmish game called Blood and Valor. And I'm kind of noticing a pattern in the naming here. Anyways, in that game, players each have tokens with specific, numbers 1 through 5, 1 through 6, something like that. And each turn, a player secretly takes one of those tokens as their bid. You compare it with your opponents. Whoever has the higher number gets to go first, but then you've used that higher number and you can't use it again until the entire round is over. Now, this removes the element of randomness that Blood and Plunder had, where you draw cards. Instead, you know for sure you have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to use each turn. But it still adds that element where it almost turns it like into a game of poker, where you're not just reading the battlefield to determine what unit you want to go with, but you're also trying to read your opponent to try and figure out what are they going to do? Are they going to take a low number this turn? Are they going to try and seize the initiative? So there's a little bit of psychological warfare. Those of you who play poker professionally would probably be fantastic at this. So this system uses randomness, but very sparingly, though it does have more of a random element than you go, I go, or alternating activations. So let's finish up our discussion here by talking about a couple other games that have introduced unique and interesting ways to combine randomness, tactics, actions, and reactions. I've recently been learning a lot about this game called Quars War. It's a game that's basically set in World War I, but in a fictional world made up of bipedal anteaters. I know, it sounds a bit odd, but by thunder, look it up, and you'll find the art and the lore is really intriguing. It's almost endearing, like in a Wallace and Gromit kind of way. But anyways, Quars War breaks a rule, or I should say discards a rule that all of the above gaming systems hold sacred, and that is each model or unit can only activate once each game round. For all these other systems we've looked at, once a model has activated, it cannot do anything else except maybe fight in melee, but it can't do anything else until the next game round. You get one chance to do something with every single unit. Now, I have not played a game of Quars War yet, so I may get some of this wrong, but based on what I've read and based on a couple bat reps I've watched, Quars War takes a very curious approach to activations. Instead of limiting activations by unit, your army has 6 units, you'll get 6 activations, there's a number of cards. Each player gets a deck of 10 cards, and each card has a certain number of activations on it. And a round doesn't go until every person has activated all of their units. It goes until the card has run out. So you start off with your deck of 10, you randomly remove just 1. Then, on your turn, your opponent takes the card. And the card, no joke here, it has a drawing of a tree on it. And the tree has 3, 4, or 5 leaves. So on your turn, your opponent draws the top card, and you then take 3 actions with any models on the table. And after you take your third action, you ask your opponent, do I have a fourth? And if you do, they'll let you know, and you can take a 4th action. And then you ask, do I have a 5th? And if you do, you can take another action. So you're guaranteed at least 3 and the possibility of 1 or 2 more, but you won't know until the moment you get there. So you can only plan for 3 and then hope for the best with the other 2. A gamble could pay off if you do, or the gamble could blow up in your face and you're leaving one of your guys stranded out in the open. Now, once you've taken actions equal to the number of leaves, you then draw the card for your opponent and the cycle repeats. That in and of itself is an interesting take on alternating activations, but like I said, there's a bigger twist. You can activate the same model each time one of your cards is drawn. You can't give any model more than 2 actions with any one card, but you could Rambo one of your models throughout the entire game while the rest just sit around with fingers nasally inserted. I mean, how many times have you played a game and wished that you could activate this one model or this one unit again and again? Well, in Quars War, you can. And on top of that, Quars War also has an interesting reaction mechanic to keep both players involved and make the combat feel more simultaneous. For example, if your opponent on their turn shoots at one of your models, you can then choose to either dive for cover or shoot back, even though it's not your turn. And whichever of those reactions you choose does not affect the number of activations that model has when it's your turn. If you choose to dive, your opponent will take penalties to hit you, but now your model is prone, and you'll have to use one of your actions to stand them back up. If you shoot back, you might just be able to knock out your opponent's model, although they get to try their shot first. This kind of dynamic is very intriguing to me because it seems more realistic, more fluid, and simultaneous. And while we're on the subject of reactions, those of you who have been watching the channel may have seen the video where Josh and I tested out the game system, The Archives of Tomorrow. And it has a similar approach to reactivations. Each unit can only activate once, but it has unlimited reactions, meaning you never get to shoot at a unit just to try and quote-unquote chip away at it, because any unit you shoot at, if it's got ranged weapons, it can shoot back. You know, kind of like what you'd expect soldiers to do in combat. I mean, seriously, could you imagine being in a war, getting shot at, and your officer, patting you on the shoulder and saying, "Sorry, son, we already shot. We're going to have to just sit there and take it." Now, to be honest, I have talked to some veterans who have indeed been shot at and were then told by their officers not to shoot back, but that's for entirely different reasons. In Archives of Tomorrow, a unit can shoot at whatever unit it wants on its own turn, but then it can shoot back at any unit that shoots at it. I know, what a crazy idea. Make a wargame an actual firefight where the two sides shoot back and forth at each other. Each unit will act in the order that the player wants during its own turn, but it will also defend itself against any other threats. I thought that Archives of Tomorrow also had a very interesting way of doing charges and melees. Now, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here. Go watch the video if you want to see it actually played out. But to summarize it really briefly, it's designed to remove from combat that automatic advantage to charging and to make it a little bit more, not necessarily random, but a little more dynamic. There's not a, "I charged you on my turn, so I get to backhand you across the face, and if anything survives, it can hit me back." Instead, when a unit declares a charge, the other unit can declare to either withdraw and try and retreat out of the charge range, or it can countercharge. If they countercharge, dice are rolled, stats are added, and the winner actually goes first. So there's a chance that the player who declares the charge, maybe their guys fail, maybe they stumble, maybe they're just don't have as much momentum as their opponent. And so when the battles finally, or when the units finally clash, it's the other guy who gets to go first or gets the advantage in combat. So both the change in how Archives of Tomorrow does shooting and melee really forces you to think different tactically. I played so much OPR, it forced me to think differently and to not look at the table and go, "Okay, you've already activated that unit, so it's done for this turn." No, nothing like that. Every unit is deadly, no matter what you do with it. So there it is, folks. Now, I know I haven't covered every potential system. I imagine every different game has one. Some more complex, some variations on the ones we've already talked about. I chose the ones that I did because they're either the most prevalent, the most unique, or the most familiar, at least to me. If you know of a game with a really interesting activation system, put it in the comments and let us know what are the advantages or disadvantages that you've noticed with that system or with any of the systems that I've mentioned here. And, as always, if you have a suggestion for a video topic or question, please put it in the comments as well. And until next time, keep your dice on the table.